1. The Black Christmas. In a remote village nestled in the woods, Christmas Eve was always a time for joy and family gatherings. This year, however, the residents were uneasy due to the disappearance of several children who had gone missing in the past few weeks. Each child was last seen in the churchyard, their presence often accompanied by a strange phenomenon. The lights in the town would flicker, and strange symbols would appear in the snow. On Christmas Eve, as the town prepared for their usual midnight service, Father Lucas decided to call off the ceremony. He had been receiving warnings from a local legend, a shadowy figure known only as the Black Santa, who was said to appear when a wrong was committed during the holiday season. The figure would curse the villagers and snatch away children in the dead of night. Despite his warnings, a few stubborn families attended the service, eager to maintain tradition. As they sang carols, the lights began to flicker, and a cold wind blew through the old church, extinguishing candles one by one. The townspeople could hear whispers in the shadows, faint, pleading voices begging them to leave before it was too late. When the service ended, the churchyard was eerily quiet. As families left, they saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching them. The next day, 5 children were missing. Only a few feet of their footprints could be seen in the snow, leading toward the dark figure. The village was left in silence, too scared to celebrate Christmas as they feared the Black Santa's return. 2. The Christmas Eve Massacre. On Christmas Eve, 1985, the Covina family in California was hosting a festive celebration at their home. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, dressed as Santa Claus, showed up with a gift in one hand and a handgun in the other. Pardo, who had just divorced his wife, was consumed with bitterness and rage, believing his ex-wife was living happily without him. His presence at the party was a shock to everyone, and many thought it was a prank when he entered with a cheerful, "Ho, ho, ho." The party went on as usual, with laughter and music, but suddenly, Pardo opened fire. In a violent rampage, he shot his ex-wife's family, her parents, her brother, and several other relatives. The violence was methodical, a calculated spree that ended with the entire house in flames as Pardo set it ablaze before fleeing. He then went to his brother's home, where he killed himself. The massacre was a shocking reminder of the darker side of the holiday season. It shattered the illusion of safety and peace that Christmas was supposed to bring. The event traumatized the town of Covina, leaving many to question how a festive gathering could turn so deadly. It remains one of the most infamous holiday horrors in modern history. The Silent Visitor. In the small town of Whitley, nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, Christmas was a season of warmth, lights, and joy. Every house glowed with decorations. Families gathered around the tree, and the smell of pine and gingerbread filled the air. For most, Christmas was a time of laughter and togetherness. But for some, the holidays could be lonely, difficult, and even terrifying. On Christmas Eve, as the town prepared for its annual midnight service, something unsettling happened. The weather had been unusually cold that year, with thick blankets of snow covering everything. The streets were eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. At precisely 11:55 p.m., a soft, steady knocking began. It was as though someone was gently tapping at every door in the town, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the empty streets. Sarah, a single mother who had recently moved to Whitley with her young son, Jake, heard the first knocks on her door. Initially, she thought it might be a child playing outside, but when Jake came running into her room, his eyes wide with fear, she knew something was wrong. "Mom, what's that noise?" he whispered, clutching her arm tightly. "Just the wind, sweetheart," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, though her own heart was pounding. She went to the door and hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the lock. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, like someone was testing the door to find out if it was locked. As if sensing her unease, Jake started to cry softly. "Mom, who's out there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know, darling," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're not opening the door? Okay." The knocks didn't stop. Instead, they grew more rhythmic, more deliberate, as if whatever was out there was counting each tap. Sarah and Jake stayed in the kitchen, huddled together, as the clock struck midnight and the knocking continued. The door. As the night wore on, the knocking did not cease. It moved from door to door, as if it were searching for something or someone. Sarah called the local police, but they assured her it was likely just a prank or kids playing in the snow. When they arrived, however, they found no one outside. The knocking continued even as they spoke with Sarah, growing more frantic as if it knew it was being watched. Jake's fear deepened as the night went on. He kept asking his mother if they were safe, if they would be okay. Sarah tried to reassure him, but her calm was wearing thin. The knocks seemed to be responding to them, growing louder or softer depending on their conversation. The policeman on the phone even suggested it might be a ghost, a story Sarah had dismissed as just that, an old story. But now, as she listened to the knocking and looked at the fear in her son's eyes, she wasn't so sure. "Mom, let's go to the church," Jake suddenly said, his voice firm. Sarah shook her head. "No, Jake, it's too dangerous. What if whatever it is follows us?" "Mom, it's Christmas Eve," he insisted. "We have to go." "That's what they do, right? They knock to be let in." Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, Jake, but if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately." They grabbed their coats and made their way to the old St. Nicholas Chapel in the center of town. As they approached, the knocking stopped abruptly, and Sarah felt an icy chill crawl up her spine. The chapel stood as a silent sentinel against the night, its spires looming like dark fingers against the sky. The chapel. Inside, the chapel was nearly empty. Only a few others had come, an elderly couple, both of whom looked more confused than frightened, and a young woman, her hands trembling as she clutched a Bible. The service was about to begin, and the elderly priest, Father Mallory, tried to put on a brave face as he welcomed the small congregation. "Welcome, my friends," he began, his voice strong but unsteady. "Tonight we celebrate the birth of peace, of hope. But there are those who cannot join us, who cannot find comfort in these walls. I ask that we remember them in our prayers." Father Mallory's eyes met Sarah's, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of fear behind his calm facade. The priest had never mentioned anything unusual about the chapel, but Sarah knew better now. Something was waiting outside, something that had been knocking on doors, seeking entry, looking for the lonely and the vulnerable. As the priest continued to speak, Sarah held Jake's hand tightly, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors. The silence in the chapel was thick. No one seemed to be listening to Father Mallory's words. Instead, they were all looking at the doors, waiting for something to happen. Subscribe for more parts.